Thank you so much for helping me. Can I really trust him?
Make yourself at home.
Hi everyone, welcome back. Please subscribe, like, and share. Now, let's get into today's story.
My hands were shaking as I typed the search bar for the third time that night. Small hidden camera, same-day delivery. I stopped myself before hitting enter, staring at the cursor blinking in that search box. And I want to be honest with you about the exact moment I realized something was deeply wrong. Not with the man asleep down the hall, but with me. Isaiah's secretary, a woman named Brianna, had been staying in our guest room for 4 days by that point. Her own apartment building undergoing emergency mold remediation that displaced 6 units at once. It was, by every reasonable measure, a mundane, sympathetic situation. Isaiah had offered our guest room the way any decent person might, barely thinking twice about it, the same way he'd once helped a coworker move apartments on a Saturday, or covered a shift for a friend going through a divorce. I sat at my kitchen table at 11 at night, my laptop open to a shopping cart with a small camera disguised as a phone charger, and I felt my own pulse in my throat the way I had exactly once before in my life, 3 years earlier, sitting in a different kitchen, married to a different man, about to set a trap that turned out to be entirely justified. I want you to understand something about that moment, because it matters enormously to everything I'm about to tell you. I didn't know yet whether I was protecting myself, or whether I was about to destroy something genuinely good, because of a wound that had nothing to do with the man sleeping 30 feet away from me. My name is Renee Ashworth. 3 years ago, I caught my husband's affair with his secretary using a hidden camera in my own home. Footage that ended a 12-year marriage in 10 seconds flat. I want to tell you, honestly, that I never once regretted setting that trap. It gave me exactly the clarity I needed, at exactly the moment I needed it. But before I tell you what happened this time, because this story does not end the way you're expecting it to, and I promise you, the truth I eventually uncovered was far more complicated than a simple repeat of my worst memory. Let us know in the comments the time and where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because I need you to stay with me through every single twist of what I'm about to explain. I closed my laptop that night without completing the purchase. I told myself I needed to sleep on it. What I didn't tell myself, not yet, was the much harder truth waiting underneath that decision. That some part of me wanted to find something wrong. Needed to find something wrong, because finding nothing wrong would mean confronting a version of my own healing I wasn't at all sure I was ready for. I had no idea, closing that laptop, exactly how far I was about to go over the following 5 days. Or exactly how much the truth I eventually found would end up teaching me about the difference between protecting myself and punishing an innocent man for someone else's betrayal. I want to take you back to where I actually was, 2.5 years before that night with my laptop open to a shopping cart, because understanding the specific shape of my healing matters enormously to understanding exactly how it started cracking again. The months following my divorce from Dominic required a kind of rebuilding I hadn't fully anticipated needing. I want to be honest about something most versions of a moving on story tend to smooth over. I didn't emerge from that marriage simply wiser and stronger, the way these stories sometimes suggest. I emerged from it considerably more suspicious of everyone, including people who'd done absolutely nothing to earn that suspicion. I remember the specific, exhausting vigilance of those early months of dating again, nearly 18 months after the divorce finalized. Once friends had finally convinced me that isolating myself indefinitely wasn't actually healing, just a different, quieter form of punishment. I went on dates during that period with men who did nothing wrong at all. And I found myself, more than once, cataloging small details the way I'd learned to during that final year of my marriage. How quickly they checked their phones, whether they mentioned female coworkers with any particular warmth, whether their explanations for canceled plans felt rehearsed. I want you to understand that this wasn't paranoia I was proud of. I recognized it, even then, as a wound rather than wisdom, though recognizing it and actually healing from it turned out to be considerably different processes. I met Isaiah at a friend's 40th birthday dinner, seated beside him almost by accident, the specific kind of unplanned proximity, that sometimes ends up mattering considerably more than either person realizes in the moment. He was a structural engineer, thoughtful in a quiet, unhurried way I found myself unexpectedly drawn to, precisely because it felt so different from anything performative. I want to walk you through the specific things that made me trust him, slowly, over our first several months together, because I think it matters to understanding how genuinely shocked I was when my old instincts resurfaced with him at all. He was the kind of person who mentioned unprompted exactly which female coworkers he worked closely with, offering the information before I ever had to ask for it, as though he understood, instinctively, that transparency mattered considerably more to me than it might to someone without my particular history. He knew about Dominic within our first month of dating, not in exhaustive detail, but enough that he understood the shape of what he was navigating with me. I remember him telling me, gently, during one of our earliest real conversations, "I'm not going to spend our relationship proving I'm not him. But I also understand if it takes you time to fully believe that." I want to be honest about how much that sentence meant to me, and how much harder it made everything that happened later, once my own trauma started working against both of us despite his best efforts. Our relationship developed slowly, deliberately, over nearly 2 years before that night with Brianna's mold-displaced apartment forced us into a situation eerily similar to the one that had ended my marriage. I want you to understand that I noticed the similarity immediately. The specific vertigo of watching history seemed to repeat itself in exact, uncanny detail. A secretary, a plausible housing emergency, a guest room suddenly occupied by a woman I barely knew. I'd made real progress in those 2 years, genuinely. I'd started therapy roughly 8 months into dating Isaiah, once I recognized on my own that some of my instincts toward him were rooted considerably more in Dominic's ghost than in anything Isaiah himself had actually done. My therapist, a patient, direct woman named Dr. Okonkwo, had helped me build language for something I hadn't fully understood before. That trauma doesn't simply disappear once you leave the situation that caused it. It reshapes how you interpret every situation that even superficially resembles it, regardless of whether the resemblance is meaningful or entirely coincidental. I want to be honest that I'd made real, measurable progress by the time Brianna's apartment flooded with mold spores serious enough to require professional remediation. I'd learned to sit with uncertainty without immediately needing to resolve it through surveillance or control. I'd learned slowly to separate Isaiah's actual behavior from Dominic's remembered behavior, even when surface details lined up in ways that made that separation genuinely difficult. Brianna Coates had worked as Isaiah's executive assistant for just under 3 years by that point, considerably longer than Chelsea had worked with Dominic before their affair began. I'd met her several times over those 2 years. Company holiday parties, a project celebration dinner, the ordinary overlapping of two people's professional and personal lives that happens naturally in any long-term relationship. I want to be honest that I'd always found her perfectly pleasant, entirely unremarkable in exactly the way that used to comfort me and this time ended up unsettling me instead, precisely because Chelsea had seemed exactly that unremarkable too, right up until she wasn't. Brianna's apartment building had experienced a serious water intrusion event 3 weeks before that night, mold remediation specialists eventually condemning 6 units, including hers, for a minimum of 2 weeks while the building underwent professional treatment. She'd been staying with her sister initially, a cramped one-bedroom situation that had grown increasingly strained once her sister's own partner moved back in from an extended work trip. Isaiah mentioned it to me on a Tuesday evening, the same casual, transparent way he mentioned everything involving his work life. "Brianna's in kind of a rough spot with her apartment situation," he said. "I was thinking about offering our guest room for a week or 2, just until she can find something more stable. I wanted to run it by you first, obviously." I want to walk you through exactly what happened inside me in the 30 seconds after he said that, because I think it matters enormously to understanding everything that followed. On the surface, I said something reasonable and generous. Of course, that makes sense, we have the space. I meant it, genuinely, in the specific way you can mean something true while an entirely different, older, more frightened version of yourself is already screaming beneath it. I felt my chest tighten in a way I recognized instantly, a physical sensation I hadn't experienced with this particular intensity in nearly a year. I want to be honest that some part of me, even in that first 30 seconds, understood exactly what was happening. I wasn't afraid of Isaiah. I was afraid of the specific, uncanny echo of circumstances that had once destroyed something I'd trusted completely. I had no idea, agreeing so readily to host Brianna, exactly how much that old fear was about to resurface over the following days. Or exactly how close I would come to repeating, almost exactly, the same surveillance I'd once used entirely justifiably against a man who deserved every ounce of suspicion I'd directed at him. Brianna arrived on a Thursday evening with 2 suitcases and an apologetic, genuinely embarrassed demeanor that I want to be honest struck me, even then, as considerably different from anything I remembered from Chelsea's arrival 3 years earlier. She thanked us repeatedly, insisted on buying groceries to contribute to the household, asked detailed, considerate questions about our routines, so she could minimize any disruption to our lives. I want to walk you through the specific details that nonetheless began pulling at my old instincts, because I think it matters to understanding how genuinely difficult it became, over those first several days, to distinguish legitimate concern from trauma-driven pattern matching. On her second night staying with us, I noticed Isaiah and Brianna laughing together in the kitchen while I finished a work call in another room. Nothing inherently suspicious, colleagues sharing an easy rapport after years of working together, but the specific sound of it, the particular warmth in Isaiah's laugh, pulled something tight in my chest that I recognized, uncomfortably, as the exact same physical sensation I'd felt watching Dominic's hand rest on Chelsea's back at that long ago holiday party. I want to be honest that I said nothing about it that night. I told myself, reasonably, that colleagues laugh together, that warmth between coworkers doesn't inherently signal anything beyond ordinary human connection. I believed that reasoning mostly, right up until the following morning, when I noticed Brianna mention, in passing over coffee, that she already knew Isaiah preferred his eggs scrambled rather than fried. A detail that shouldn't have meant anything at all. Colleagues who've worked together for 3 years reasonably picking up small personal preferences through years of shared lunches and work trips, and yet it landed in my chest with the exact same weight as Chelsea's, last time I stayed. Over comment 3 years earlier. I confronted myself about this reaction directly, that same morning, sitting alone in my car in our driveway before work, forcing myself to examine, honestly, whether I was responding to something real or purely to an old wound being pressed by coincidental circumstantial similarity. I called Dr. Okonkwo's office and scheduled an emergency session for that same week, recognizing, even as I made the call, that I needed outside perspective before I trusted my own read of the situation any further. Dr. Okonkwo listened carefully as I described the specific details pulling at me. The laughter, the eggs, the general uncanny resemblance of circumstances to my marriage's final months. She asked me a question that I've thought about many times since, one that cut directly to the heart of what I was actually experiencing. Has Isaiah done anything in these 2 years that resembles what Dominic did? She asked. Or are you responding entirely to circumstances that resemble what happened, regardless of his actual behavior within those circumstances? I sat with that question for a long moment, because I understood, honestly, that the answer complicated the clean narrative I'd been building in my own head. Isaiah hadn't hidden anything. He'd told me about the arrangement before it happened, rather than presenting it as already decided. He hadn't taken any calls behind closed doors, hadn't grown distant or evasive, hadn't displayed a single one of the specific behavioral patterns that had actually preceded Dominic's affair, as opposed to simply the surface-level circumstantial similarity of a secretary temporarily living in our home. I think, I told Dr. Okonkwo carefully, that I'm responding to the shape of the situation more than anything Isaiah's actually done within it. That's an important distinction, she said. But I also want you to understand that recognizing it intellectually doesn't automatically make the fear disappear. Trauma responses don't operate on logic alone. The question now is what you do with that fear, now that you can see it more clearly for what it actually is. I want to be honest with you about what happened after that session, because I think it matters considerably more to this story than a tidy resolution where insight alone fixes everything. I left Dr. Okonkwo's office that afternoon with genuine clarity about what I was experiencing. And within 48 hours, I was sitting at my kitchen table at 11 at night, searching for a hidden camera anyway. I want to walk you through the specific reasoning I used to justify that decision to myself, because I think understanding the internal logic of it matters to understanding how trauma actually operates, rather than how we imagine it operating from the outside. I told myself I wasn't doing this out of paranoia. I was doing it for certainty. I told myself that if I gathered proof and found nothing, I could finally, fully let go of the suspicion undermining my relationship. I told myself, essentially, that surveillance was the path to healing rather than a repetition of the exact behavior that had once been genuinely necessary, but was, in this new context, something considerably more complicated. I ordered the camera at 11:40 that night, disguised inside a phone charger this time rather than a plant pot, telling myself I'd simply place it in our home office. A room where Isaiah occasionally worked evenings, and a room Brianna had legitimate reason to be in given an ongoing project deadline the following week. I had no idea, placing that order, exactly how thoroughly I was about to relive the worst chapter of my life, chasing a ghost that had nothing meaningfully to do with the man I was actually about to surveil. Nor did I know exactly what that camera was actually going to capture. Footage that would end up teaching me something considerably more complicated than a simple confirmation of guilt or innocence. The camera arrived the following afternoon, and I want to walk you through exactly how I placed it, because the specific deliberateness of that process mirrored my actions 3 years earlier in a way that unsettled me even as I did it. I positioned it on a bookshelf in our home office, angled toward the desk where Isaiah and Brianna would be reviewing project materials for an upcoming deadline. I told myself, placing it, that I was gathering information rather than manufacturing suspicion. I want to be honest that some part of me already understood the thinness of that distinction, even as I convinced myself to proceed anyway. The first 2 days of footage showed exactly what I should have expected, had I been thinking clearly rather than through the fog of old trauma. Isaiah and Brianna working through spreadsheets and project timelines with the specific, focused tedium of actual colleagues doing actual work. I watched hours of footage showing nothing more scandalous than discussions about material costs and construction timelines, occasionally interrupted by Isaiah making coffee or Brianna taking a work call from her own client. I want to be honest about the specific, complicated relief and disappointment I felt watching that footage. Relief, because some healthier part of me genuinely wanted Isaiah to be exactly who he'd shown himself to be for 2 years. Disappointment, in a much darker corner of myself I wasn't proud of, because some old, wounded part of me had almost wanted to find something, needing external proof that my suspicion had been justified rather than simply an echo of unhealed trauma. On the third night, the footage showed something that stopped my breath entirely, something I want to walk you through carefully, because the specific ambiguity of what I witnessed became the most important detail in this entire story. Brianna had been crying at Isaiah's desk, late in the evening, well after I'd gone to bed believing both of them had turned in as well. Isaiah sat beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder, his voice too quiet for the camera's microphone to fully capture, though I could make out fragments. Something about he's not worth this, something about her deserving so much better. I want to describe, honestly, the specific spiral this footage sent me into, because it perfectly illustrates how genuinely difficult it can be to distinguish real evidence from trauma-activated pattern matching. My mind moved immediately to the worst possible interpretation, constructing an entire narrative of emotional infidelity from a single ambiguous clip, the same way I imagine anyone with my specific history might have. I paused the footage roughly 40 times that night, replaying that hand on her shoulder, that quiet, comforting tone, searching for confirmation of exactly the betrayal I feared. I want to be honest that I very nearly did what I'd done 3 years earlier. Confronting them both over a meal, footage queued up and ready, prepared to end another relationship based on evidence I hadn't yet fully understood. I sat with my phone in hand for nearly an hour, the footage paused on that exact frame, genuinely prepared to destroy something 2 years in the making based on an image that, viewed through a different lens entirely, might mean something considerably more innocent than what my trauma was insisting it meant. Something stopped me, that night, that hadn't stopped me 3 years earlier. A specific, hard-won moment of clarity I want to credit directly to the work I'd done with Dr. Okonkwo. I asked myself the same question she'd posed to me in our session. Was I responding to something Isaiah had actually done, or to the shape of a moment that merely resembled betrayal on its surface? I decided that night to do something I hadn't done 3 years earlier with Dominic. I decided to ask directly, honestly, before assuming I already knew the answer. I found Isaiah alone in our bedroom the following morning, and I told him, honestly, what I'd done, the camera, the footage, the specific spiral of fear that had led me there. I want to be honest that this confession terrified me considerably more than confronting Dominic ever had, because this time, I understood clearly that I might be the one who'd actually done something wrong. Isaiah's reaction. I want to walk you through carefully, because it mattered enormously to everything that followed. He didn't erupt in anger, though I understood he would have had every right to. He sat with what I'd told him for a long moment, visibly processing both the invasion of privacy and the specific pain underlying it. Show me the footage, he said quietly. The specific moment that scared you. I showed him. I watched his face as he watched it, and I saw something considerably more complicated than guilt cross his features, a kind of tired, sad recognition. Brianna's going through a divorce, he said quietly. Her husband's been cheating on her for months. That night, she'd just found out he moved in with the woman he's been seeing. I was comforting a friend who was falling apart, Renee. That's genuinely all that happened. I want to be honest that I didn't immediately believe him, not because I doubted his sincerity, but because 3 years of trauma doesn't simply dissolve the instant someone offers a reasonable explanation. I asked him, as gently as I could manage, whether I could speak with Brianna directly, to hear her account of that night in her own words. He agreed immediately, without hesitation or defensiveness, which itself told me something important about the specific difference between him and Dominic that I hadn't fully let myself trust until that exact moment. I had no idea, asking to speak with Brianna directly, exactly how much that single conversation was about to teach me. Not just about that particular night, but about the much larger, more difficult work I still had left to do in actually healing from what Dominic had taken from me. Brianna agreed to speak with me that same afternoon, and I want to walk you through that conversation carefully, because it became, in many ways, the actual emotional climax of this entire story. Not a confrontation with a guilty party, but a confrontation with my own unhealed grief. We sat together in our kitchen, the same table where I'd once sat searching for a hidden camera, and I told her, honestly, what I'd witnessed and why it had frightened me. I want to be honest that I expected some defensiveness, some discomfort at being confronted about a private, vulnerable moment I'd captured without her knowledge or consent. Instead, Brianna simply looked exhausted, in the specific way people look when they're carrying grief considerably larger than the moment currently asking something of them. I found out 3 weeks ago that my husband's been having an affair for almost a year, she said quietly. The same week my apartment flooded, actually. I haven't told many people, because I've been trying to hold it together enough to keep working. She told me in careful, painful detail, about the night I'd witnessed on camera. A night she'd finally broken down after weeks of forced composure. Isaiah simply being present with her the way, she said, a good friend is present with someone falling apart, nothing more than that. I want to be honest about the specific shame I felt, hearing her account, understanding that I'd spent 3 days constructing an entire narrative of betrayal around a woman quietly grieving her own marriage's collapse, using a camera I'd hidden without her knowledge, in a home she'd been sincerely grateful simply to have shelter in. I'm sorry, I told her, and I meant it considerably more deeply than the words alone could carry. I projected something onto that night that had nothing to do with what was actually happening. I want to walk you through what happened after Brianna left the room, because the hardest part of this entire story wasn't the conversation with her. It was the conversation I finally had to have with myself. I sat alone in that kitchen for a long time, turning over everything that had happened over the previous 5 days. The shaking hands over a shopping cart, the hidden camera, the ambiguous footage I'd nearly used to end a genuinely good relationship. I understood, with a clarity I'd been avoiding for 3 years, that Dominic hadn't just broken my trust in him. He'd broken my trust in my own judgment, leaving me susceptible to seeing his betrayal reflected in situations that had nothing meaningfully to do with him at all. I called Dr. Okonkwo that same evening, and I want to be honest about what I told her, because I think it matters to anyone listening who's ever recognized a version of this same pattern in their own life. I almost destroyed something real, I told her, because I couldn't tell the difference between my instincts and my trauma. And I'm not sure I trust myself to tell the difference reliably even now. Dr. Okonkwo's response has stayed with me since. That uncertainty is actually a good sign, she said. The people who never question their own reactions are the ones who stay stuck in the pattern indefinitely. You caught yourself this time. Even if it took nearly destroying something to do it. That's real progress, even though it doesn't feel like it right now. I found Isaiah that evening and I told him everything. Not just what had happened with the camera, but the deeper fear underneath it, the specific way Dominic's betrayal had left me unable to fully trust my own perception of safety, even with someone who had genuinely earned it. I want to be honest that Isaiah could have responded to this conversation with understandable frustration, even anger, given what I'd put him through over a situation that turned out to be entirely innocent. Instead, he listened carefully and told me something I've held on to since. I'm not upset that you were scared, he said. Fear isn't something you chose. I'm glad you told me the truth instead of ending things based on something that wasn't real. But Renee, I need you to actually do the work this uncovered, not just apologize and move forward the same way you have been. I can't spend this relationship being quietly investigated every time something reminds you of him. I want you to understand how much that specific boundary meant to me, hearing it, because it was exactly the kind of honest, respectful directness I genuinely needed and hadn't fully received from anyone in my life since my marriage ended. I increased my therapy sessions to twice weekly following that conversation. Working specifically on the trauma responses Dr. Okonkwo helped me finally name directly. Hypervigilance, pattern matching based on surface similarity rather than actual behavior, an instinct toward control that I'd once needed for genuine survival, and now needed to actively unlearn in a context where it no longer served any real protective purpose. I had no idea, committing to that harder, slower work, exactly how much it would eventually change not just my relationship with Isaiah, but my entire relationship with my own fear. It's been just over a year now since that week with Brianna's flooded apartment, and I want to give you an honest account of where things actually landed, rather than a tidier resolution than real healing usually offers. Isaiah and I are still together, genuinely stronger for having survived what I nearly did to us. I want to be honest that the months following that week required real, sustained work on both our parts, not just my individual therapy, but honest, sometimes difficult conversations between us about exactly where my trauma responses might resurface, and what he needed from me in those moments beyond simple apology. I've learned slowly to recognize the specific physical sensation of old fear activating, the tightness in my chest, the particular quality of suspicion that arrives faster than actual evidence, and to name it out loud to Isaiah rather than acting on it unilaterally through surveillance or silent withdrawal. He's learned, in turn, to offer transparency not as proof of innocence, but simply as an ongoing act of care for someone healing from something that happened before he was ever part of my life. Brianna and I have become, unexpectedly, genuine friends since that difficult conversation in my kitchen. I want to be honest that I felt considerable guilt, initially, reaching out to her again after what I'd done, but she met that guilt with a grace I hadn't necessarily earned, telling me once that she understood, more than most people might, exactly how thoroughly betrayal can distort your perception of everyone around you afterward. She finalized her own divorce 8 months ago, and I was there, alongside Isaiah, the night she signed the paperwork, a small, quiet dinner that felt, in its own way, like a genuine testament to how much all three of us had grown through a situation that could have ended considerably worse than it did. I've thought often, over this past year, about the specific difference between the instinct that once genuinely protected me, and the trauma response that nearly destroyed something good this time. I want to offer you the clearest distinction I've managed to find, because I think it matters enormously to anyone who's ever carried a similar wound into a new relationship. Real instinct responds to actual behavior, evasiveness, inconsistency, patterns of genuine deception happening in front of you. Trauma responds to circumstance, to surface resemblance, to the shape of a situation regardless of what the person actually within it is doing. The two can feel identical in the moment, carrying the exact same physical urgency, the same conviction of certainty. Learning to tell them apart, I've discovered, isn't a single moment of clarity. It's an ongoing practice, one I still have to consciously engage in more often than I'd like to admit. If you've ever carried real betrayal into a new relationship, watching old wounds activate in situations that resemble your worst memory without actually being your worst memory repeating itself, I want you to hear this clearly. Your fear is valid. What happened to you is real, and the vigilance you developed afterward once served a genuine, necessary purpose. But vigilance that once protected you can left unexamined, eventually punish people who did nothing to deserve it. Projecting an old betrayal onto a person who's actually shown you, consistently, exactly who they are. I nearly destroyed a genuinely good relationship, because I couldn't yet tell the difference between the man in front of me and the ghost of the man who came before him. I'm grateful, more than I can fully express, that something in me finally slowed down long enough to ask the harder question before acting on the easier, more familiar fear. Healing, I've learned, isn't the absence of old fear resurfacing. It's what you choose to do the moment you notice it has.